Today's DataViz Society Fireside Chat is all about building data literacy, and I'm excited to have three amazing panelists joining us for this conversation. Unfortunately, one of our panelists couldn't make it due to a health issue at the last minute, but we are excited to have our three panelists here today. We'll dig into who's joining us in just a moment, but want to first acknowledge Excella, who's providing the Zoom webinar services that we're using today for this DVS webinar. We have three different panelists who'll be sharing their insights. Mary is someone who helps organizations make sense of qualitative, quantitative, observation, ethnographic, semiotic, and social media findings to expand opportunities. You can see where you can connect with Mary and find more information about her work here on the screen, and we'll be sharing additional links in the follow-up materials. Alan is a freelance writer and education advocate for data literacy and the democratization of data. He writes a lot on the Nightingale Journal for DVS, which we greatly appreciate, and is someone who is a newly named Tableau social ambassador, maybe for the second time, Alan, I think. And then our last panelist today is Rama, for whom the slide is not loading. Rama is a advocate and data visualization and analytics enthusiast from South Africa, joining us from South Africa. Rama, we're excited to go ahead and have you joining us today. He works as the Monitoring, Evaluation, Research, and Learning Officer at Data Innovates. And he'll be sharing more about his background and the work that they do during the time that we're spending together today. Finally, not joining us, but someone who contributed to the thinking and framing around this conversation is Sarah, who's an education advocate for individuals who don't have access to traditional education or have a degree. And we want to make mention that she makes a lot of great posts and resources about data literacy and data education through her Twitter profile, as well as on her website. As we go ahead and walk into today's session, we are doing this session live. We think these fireside chats are a great chance to have a true fireside chat type format where we're actually chatting, talking to each other, and hearing your questions. So you'll see a Q&A box down at the bottom of the Zoom bar. You'll see that there's a little Q&A logo. And on that Q&A logo, when you click on it, you'll be able to submit your questions in terms of questions that you'd like to tackle and talk about in today's session. Any question is fair game to ask to the panelists, and I'll be filtering through and helping to moderate the conversation. To wrap up our introductions, just so that you know who I am Amanda Makulec. I am the Data Visualization Society Operations Director, and I will be your moderator today. And I'm excited to bring together these three different panelists. Hi, team.
Hello.
Hi. With that, we'll go ahead and we're going to let each of our panelists give a bit more context and background about who they are and what the framework they're bringing to today's conversation is in terms of their work in data literacy. We'll go ahead and kick it off with Mary to get started. Mary, if you've got some slides to share, go ahead and throw those up on the screen.
Will do. How's that? Can you guys see those? Okay, great. Thanks for joining us today, everyone. My name is Mary Aviles, and as my profile indicated, I'm an experienced strategist and researcher. So I'm not a data visualizer like many of you, although I really rely on partnering with visualizers because I have to help my clients and my stakeholders on my work to understand the relevance of my findings. And so in doing that, I came late to the understanding of myself as a data person. I don't have a math background. I have an English background. I'm a words person, and I'm mostly a qualitative market researcher. So what I do is look for structure in unstructured data, primarily in words and transcripts from interviews, and in visuals and imagery. And in things like product reviews and things like that. And in my recent work over the last 3 to 5 years in nonprofit, it's become clear to me that many of the folks that I work with on a daily basis have no understanding for how data is relevant in their life. And so I spent a lot of time doing conversations for folks not like yourselves who are experienced practitioners, but with everyday folks who don't recognize that data sort of permeates or underlies everything that we do. And I really like this quote because in my work in nonprofits in the Detroit area, we work with many societal issues, early child care. We work with literacy, actual literacy, not data literacy issues. And what I have worried about in my work with data is that there's, that data literacy or fluency is a gap that people are just not keeping up with the speed with which data has sort of permeated everything that we do. And so that's been sort of what got me into this work. The other thing is that so much of the work that we do is rooted in different types of equity and inequity. And so what I try to explain to people when I'm working with them is really that, data are people, right? It's collected. I love this quote from Catherine Madden and her image that she shared on her Twitter or her Instagram a few weeks ago. And just the point that, we just have to be very aware of what we're doing, that data are not objective. And no matter how hard we try, and we have to really try to be intentional about prioritizing equity throughout the process. In market research, it's very similar to data visualization in that every step of the process has an opportunity for inequity. Who's funding the project, who's been selected to do the consultants that are selected on the project, who's being interviewed, how much information is being shared with who's being interviewed or researched, and all the way out to how we present, what languages or assets we present when we present findings, and being very intentional about that whole process and the opportunities for inequity throughout the process, I think has become a big focus of my work. And just finally, the exciting part is that, as we all know, as practitioners, it's our responsibility, I feel, to help ensure that people all across the various sectors of society can use data to advance their causes and to help them engage societally and civically. And so that's a big part. That's I think the opportunity that we all have, and what I spend time talking to people about.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Mary. And that great set of sketch notes from the Foundations of Data Equity workshop that Heather runs are a really great visualization of a lot of those kind of themes. So thanks for sharing that. Alan, do you want to give us a few words about your background, perspective, and what you feel like you're bringing to the Zoom table today?
Sure. Well, good morning. I'm happy to be here this morning, really excited. I'm Alan. As mentioned earlier, I am an instructor at Columbia University's School of Professional Studies, where I teach storytelling with data. In addition, I curate an article series where I talk about the impact of data on society, how people have leveraged it. Two people that come to mind quickly that I wrote about have been W.E.B. Du Bois and Florence Nightingale. They were not necessarily data people, but they used data effectively to get their messages across. My perspective on data literacy has been framed by my career. I have an engineering background, and I spent the majority of my career doing data reporting, working with databases, analytics. And what I also did in my career is that I positioned myself where I would always be an ambassador between business teams and data teams. And so with that, that has given me, and this is a term that I found out about recently, it has given me data empathy. So with data empathy, you can understand the flow of data in your organization, but most importantly, you can understand the audience. So you can understand that everyone, in this particular case, and even in yours probably, that everyone doesn't use data the same way. So in the high level, business people may not look at data the way a data person does. And especially with the influx of data that we have now, there's just so much, just to keep it simple. But business teams in general are looking to make quick decisions to validate a hypothesis they have. They may not always have the time to get a nice buttoned up report, which us data practitioners are used to doing earlier on in our career, or even still that we're doing. So I think having that empathy, putting ourselves in each other's positions or what they may do as part of the organization, that can get us closer to what is being more data informed or having more data literacy. But one of the key takeaways about data literacy that I have is that you don't have to be a data scientist to be data literate. And I think that's something that we all have to also take with us as we go along in our career. And, you know, outside of the corporate part, I do believe that data literacy can help with social mobility. So I also work with different organizations like Data Stories, where they are building a platform for educators to create data clubs for high school students. So starting the process a little early. And also there's another organization I work with, Kids and Data. So they are using gamification, AKA Space Invaders, to teach middle school students about data. So all of these things, and in addition to looking to help underserved communities, that's a personal goal that I've been working on as well. I spent six months in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, where I was interfacing with local politicians and workforce development agencies to kind of understand what standing up a data literacy program would look like. Workforce development has been traditionally used in nursing and in construction, and so I think it's time to incorporate some sort of technical type program as well. So again, I'm excited to be here, and I will let the rest of the panel talk.
Well, and that seems like a great segue over to Rama and the context and background you bring and the work that you guys are doing at Data Innovator in terms of really looking at how do we build these kind of data skills, like cross-cutting data skills, not just in one country, but across a continent. So Rama, a little bit of context from you.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for having me. Really excited to be part of this conversation today. So I think firstly, to start off, my background is in economics. And what I really enjoyed about studying this degree was it kind of showed me that, you know what, people are important and contexts are important, and context kind of rule everything, right? And I sometimes feel that there's this misconception about economics that it's all about money and banks and, you know, just how the economy works, right? But ultimately, if you look at it in greater detail, you find out that economics is more a social science than anything else, because ultimately you're studying people's behavior, right? And what they really teach us to do is how to model for that behavior. And so from that, I kind of got, you know, an insight into data, but then also what this data means, particularly in terms of human behavior. And so with that in mind, I kind of took this and I decided, you know what, I actually don't really want to go and be a banker or do anything that most economists kind of do. And I figured that I want to go the social route and see how my skills can, you know, help for the betterment of people, particularly Africa. And so I did a bit of monitoring and evaluation work in varsity, tried freelancing here and there just to kind of, you know, get a feel of the world. And then directly after university, I then joined Data Innovator as the monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning officer. And essentially what my job entails is a lot of times, you know, people have social interventions, and these interventions will be funded by either governments or foundations or anyone who really wants to fund some sort of program, right? And ultimately, these programs have some sort of objective that they want to meet, whether it's in health, whether it's in education, whether it's climate change, you know? So they have these interventions, and these interventions are based on certain assumptions that, hey, if we train this person, this is the action we'll kind of get at the end of it. And essentially, my job is to go in there and look at this and really just evaluate whether firstly this is happening or not, and whether this action is the appropriate action to lead to this certain outcome. And so that's a lot of the work that I do, and a lot of it entails data, right? So you'd kind of go out there, you need to create instruments to collect data to actually figure out whether, you know, this intervention is working or not and what's actually happening on the ground. And also a big part of the work that we do at Data Innovator is, as mentioned, it's a lot of social work. And so a lot of times these organizations will kind of call us in so that we can host workshops on data literacy, data visualization. And what we found was a lot of these organizations are generally organizations that are aware of data and the power that it has, but a lot of times they struggle with the communication part of it. So a lot of the times it's like people working in universities, and they are researchers, right? So they understand data, they kind of understand how to manipulate it and tell some sort of story with it. But the problem is the communication, right? So being able to communicate to different stakeholders, meaning different messages and different language that you need to use. And with that, we found, okay, so there's some sort of skills gap in the data market. And what we saw is that, these are people who are aware of data. So what does this mean for people who aren't aware of data and who aren't necessarily data literate? And with that, we started doing a bit more research, and we found that actually there's this misconception that, to use data in your everyday life or in your workspace, you kind of need to be a data scientist, as Alan alluded to earlier. And there's this misconception that we are actually really trying to debunk within people. And also particularly for Africa, because Africa struggles because a lot of our economies are still quite informal, right? So what happens is there'll be like lots of daily transactions. So there are lots of data points, but ultimately a lot of these data points are lost because people don't fully understand, the power of data and how to harness it. And, it just seems like you need to work at Google or have some sort of data designation to actually use it. And yeah, and so with that, we've kind of created a spin-off of Data Innovator called Data Heroes, which is essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to create data heroes out of everyone, right? So people should be using data within their context and within their world. And at this point in time, that's really what we're trying to figure out is how do we exactly go out into the whole of Africa, and teach people the value of data. Yeah, so that's me in a nutshell.
Amazing. Well, it's great to hear all of your different and varied backgrounds, from economics to qualitative research over to teaching and training and doing a lot of this hands-on work with data literacy. I know we threw around a lot of phrases when we were talking in these introductions around how we understand information. I heard data fluency, data literacy, data use. Why, regardless of what we call it, why is this particular topic and the idea of building data literacy so important today? Why is it critical for us to think through today? I wonder maybe, Rama, since we came to you last, do you want to give us a quick thought on what that feels like and looks like in your context?
Yeah, in our context, I think the first place to start off with is South Africa isn't in a very good place in terms of our socioeconomics, right? If we look at things like our unemployment rate, particularly our youth unemployment rate, I know at the beginning of the year, it was sitting at above 50%, right, of youth unemployed. And then you couple that with just the amount of data that is generated daily, and also just the trajectory that the world is kind of moving into, right? So, and people kind of use the term the fourth industrial revolution. People, and to be honest, I don't quite know what the fourth industrial revolution means, right? And I think it's for us to actually decide and create our own paths with that, right? And I think for me, data literacy is very important because I think it can change the socioeconomics of South Africa, particularly because, we just don't have enough skills. And, if we look at then our youth unemployment rate, that's where we see that, hey, look, actually, there's a whole bunch of people out there that we can actually teach and create skills that people can actually use. And I think the goal that I have and the goal that we have at Data Heroes is what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to create a skills force within South Africa that can service the world's data needs. Because ultimately also with the way the world is moving, working from home, working remotely is becoming an important thing, right? And as a data person, or if you have some sort of data designation and you're working with data, you actually don't need to go into the office, and remote work is a great place for you, right? So, and the first place to start with that is data literacy, right? So people need to understand, data. They need to be able to interpret data. If you kind of have a graph or you have a chart, you need to be able to know what it all means. And that's like the base step, right? So you can't kind of become a data scientist without actually understanding what data is. And I think that's why it's so important for us is, the first step is data literacy and showing people that, hey, this is actually a path that you can follow. And as I mentioned, particularly for youth, because I feel it's a very dire situation, and if we don't fix it, it's something that's definitely going to be very detrimental to us in a couple of years. I just think data can really help with our youth unemployment position. Yeah.
Alan, do you have some thoughts as well on the question around why this is an important topic today?
Oh, yes, definitely. So like Rama was saying, I do believe that, we are so inundated with data as a society that I think data is touching every career vertical, every industry. And I think the more people are comfortable with data, and that's part of what data literacy is, being able to be comfortable with it, being able to communicate with it, articulate, draw insights. So it's definitely important because we are in a more information age, and data is more readily available with a lot of the tools that we have, visualization. So I think that anyone, no matter if you're marketing or human resources, you're leveraging data, and the more comfortable you are with it, it can definitely help with your career trajectory. And it's touching on the outside of the corporate or business world. Yes, for people who are looking to gain more opportunities, the more you know about data, the better. So it's definitely an important topic. And then, again, just to stress that, we have so many words out there, but pretty much data literacy, as I see it, is just being able to communicate, being more comfortable with data, being able to, analyze, draw insights, tell stories from it.
Well, and Mary, we've talked a lot about kind of this focus on how we train people to have these skills and a lot in a workforce context. Do you have other thoughts about kind of the current relevance of data literacy in today's environment?
I do. I just think there's such a prevalence because we are a community of practitioners. I don't think that we recognize sort of the ubiquity of people who struggle. Pew Research reports that 91% of Americans today feel they lost control of their data and they don't know what to do to get it back. And that's almost 100% of Americans, right? So it's a big problem. I was having a conversation for a recent DBS article with data artist Jer Thorpe, and he was talking about sort of the open data revolution and how it never really, which was a term I had not heard as sort of an outside of the field person. And, he just talked about the fact that for most people, data are impenetrable. And that they are only for people like the majority of this audience with rarefied skills. And that, we have expected people, everyday people, to come to our table, but that it's incumbent upon practitioners like ourselves to build community, around data literacy. If Sarah were here, she would bring up that there's a separate or related, very important foundational element to this, that access and adoption of the sort of on-ramp to data via the internet and broadband access is lacking so many people. I was reading a Brookings Institute piece this morning that quoted Washington Post research that 90% of Detroit's 51,000 students, primarily in African-American school district, can't access the internet. That's 90%, again, big numbers. So that's why I think that literacy is such a pressing issue, especially I think as a sort of a basic right that is becoming more apparent, obviously, in the midst of a pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, those numbers are just staggering in terms of thinking about what that means for students who are expected to join and do remote learning and other pieces like that. I mean, that's just a staggering number. We've got a great question from Jessica asking about kind of building data literacy within organizations. So thinking about the organizations we work in. And she asks, when building data literacy internally, say within a nonprofit, what's a reasonable level of literacy to strive for, especially if there is already a data person within the organization, where it can be hard to know where their role ends? That kind of over-reliance on those one or two experts who can always seem to answer the questions for you versus building out that fabric. Alan?
I'll take that. So I think, in general with organizations, having worked with business teams, a lot of times when you're in an organization, you will have a dashboard or you will have some sort of visualization tool that you're expecting the business team to use. So I think having that team get more knowledgeable about using the department dashboards that are built, or even just being able to do pivot tables in Excel, that's a big relative step for a lot of people who may not be as familiar or comfortable with data. But I would say that in terms of data literacy, having the business team to be kind of to self-serve, I don't like to use terms like buzzwords, but having them like be able to use like their dashboards. Like I've had situations where, you know, you are partnering with a business team and there is like 1 or 2 people who are very eager to learn more, and they are able to take control or to command the dashboard, and then they're able to further ask questions. Because we have to remember sometimes too that, you know, we're coming, or some people are coming at this from being a data practitioner, but a lot of business people and definitely in organizations, they have more knowledge about what they're looking at and what they're analyzing. Sometimes data people just know the columns or they just know the data points, but they don't really have the business context. So that's why a lot of times you have to work together. And just to get back to that answering that question and reiterating, is just if you're able to at least, like I said, take advantage of the dashboards that are available, or even to crunch some of your own numbers in Excel and have a conversation with the data person, I think that is my ideal of the beginnings of data literacy, and it's probably a good chunk for most people.
Interesting. I just keeps making me reflect back on my time working in nonprofits and international development, and the questions about the difference between like being able to interact with and use the data itself, like the pivot tables even that you talked about, versus being able to read a chart. Can I read a chart and kind of glean insight or information from it? Rama, Mary, any thoughts from you on this question around what that baseline level of data literacy is we should be striving for across organizations and teams?
In my experience, I couldn't get to a level because so many of the folks that I've been working with don't even have a data person in-house. And so words like, when I see sort of common reaction when you say words like data or infrastructure or systemic, right? It's like the same thing that happens on the face of a kid who doesn't like math, right? Like their face, you know, they just don't understand. And so a lot of times instead what we've had to do are think about sort of lighting up the data that they do have, sort of showing them what they have. And then again, leaning towards the simplest possible tech solution. So, you know, Alan's point about the pivot table, and then sort of talking about analytical choices, taking them through trade-offs and the thinking behind various approaches. And really then to evaluate individual people's literacy and choose, you know, appropriately intuitive systems that can help get to some kind of shared capability. And then be very clear about, to your point about roles, be very clear about whose role is what, the data, you know, in what is the data person's role? And then to Alan's point, you know, what is the partner entity, you know, the partner person in your nonprofit, for example, they represent, you know, communal knowledge that's still very valuable. They just need help with the tools. So you do have to partner up. So I really can't answer the question about level because we don't even have a baseline most of the time.
One thing I will add though is that a lot of times, and I know for organization's sake, we have to have those different distinctions, but a lot of times too, and there was actually an article by Scott Baronato for HBR, where he talks about talent matrix. So you try to understand the talent that's in your organization. So there are some people where they may have a defined role due to whatever reason, their education, their background, but they may have a talent to want to tell stories or maybe even want to get more involved with data, but they may not have the official title. So that's where you have to kind of take a step back and kind of assess people's talent. And also another thing that's to add to Mary's comments is familiarity. You know, a lot of people are going to be motivated because they're familiar with something, or there is just a financial motivation. They need their job, just to keep it real. But I mean, there's going to be different things that's going to help people learn. And, you know, even with going back to the community thing, you know, there's been models where people are partnering with either local like museums or community centers to get local people to understand more about the community. That's a motivation for them. And they may not have the access to like a job that has, you know, where they're doing data crunching, but something that can get them learning about data through something that's familiar to them or something that they feel is going to benefit them. Those are different ways to start getting to those levels of data literacy.
Rama?
Yeah, I think a lot of my work, or a lot of our work generally, is within the nonprofit sector, right? And whenever we do go into these organizations, and whether we're hosting a M&E workshop or whether we're trying to reevaluate the theory of change and really start getting people to think about, the intervention and how it all plays out. A lot of times when you actually kind of break it down into their day-to-day like work that they do, and actually make them see that ultimately they are like one cog out of the bigger picture. And you just kind of get them to see that, hey, like the work that you do forms part of this bigger picture, but you kind of need to make sure that your cog works out well, right? And that's the big thing, is you kind of need to make them see that with data they can actually start improving their work that they do specifically. Because sometimes what I find as well is data is just like this big word that is used. And also, on Alan's point, when you have these dashboards that people can kind of go look at, a lot of times their particular work is lost within that, right? It's all aggregated into all these big numbers. Whereas when people can actually see what their work specifically does and the numbers behind that and how to better communicate that, people start actually being more in charge of it. Because I think ultimately that's the big thing that people want to be able to see, is they want to be able to see where their work goes and how they can improve. And so I think that's really the first step. And I think I'd also, agree with Mary that kind of having the baseline is kind of missing. And ultimately people just need to be able to see data within their context, because ultimately when it becomes something that is a bit too far-fetched or a bit, something that you don't see every day, then it kind of goes over your head and you're not as interested as you would be. Whereas, if you see how it actually affects you and your work, you'd probably be more interested in doing it. And then I think the big thing is, once you're more responsible for it, you are probably even more keen, to learn more about it. So if you, in your organization, if you have an M&E person or a data person, right, then you kind of have the onus to then go to the data person and say, hey, look, I'm really trying to improve on this thing. Can you help me out? How do I think of this in a data way? And so Alan kind of mentioned that, the two of them need to work together. And that's the big thing, is as much as us as data professionals need to be able to go out there and share with people, we need to create a space where they can come and share with us too, and feel comfortable to ask questions, and make it look fun too. I think that's
I love that point of that big point about collaboration and two-way dialogues. I think is so important. And Bridget chimed in with, I thought, something that really summed up some of these points really well, that you really have to make it simple, start small, pick a few agreed upon metrics as a team, consistently show them those metrics and measures and look at it and build on it, which I think is a great idea in terms of kind of what do you pick that's not trying to go ahead and tackle the entire world of all the data in an organization, but focusing on the things that people know. We have another great question here from Ariane, asking about measuring literacy. So how do we measure literacy, data literacy, graphicacy, of who can read what from given visualizations and what value they take away from it? I'm not sure if folks have seen different scales or pieces. I know another person had chimed in and pointed to looking at trying to create like a graph literacy scale. This person indicated that they were working on a 4-item test to assess if individuals can read, understand, and apply data in basic graph types, which is really interesting in terms of trying to create these simple assessments. It looks like they're working on this in a healthcare setting around assessing baseline graph literacy. Have you seen other kind of assessment approaches or other ways that even qualitatively you've worked with people to understand their level of literacy? Mary, maybe to you first.
And again, because I'm starting from like a before baseline most of the time, I'm not able to sort of measure. I can just tell, Rama is a what we call, Merle, what we call, Merle. And most of the folks I work with locally in Detroit, we don't even have an evaluator that we're working with. So we just don't even have baseline. What I really like to try to do is talk to, is really sort of expose people to data in real life, right? And so that's one of, I'm always looking for examples, and oftentimes, interestingly, it starts out with some kind of a map, because people can understand their physical place, and they can begin to understand their interaction with physical place. And much of the work that we're doing is in such a local context that physical place is sort of a relevant thing. But mapping is just the first step, and then that can help to identify gaps, which can lead to a discussion about, data collection. And, you know, so then people start to think about data in a context that's relevant to them. So I don't really have levels or tools for assessing because, you know, I'm sort of starting at before zero in most of my conversations.
Yeah. Alan?
I was just going to add that I think this is one of the, I guess, challenges that we still have on this topic, that there isn't any official assessment, you know, or any data literacy score. I did see someone in the comments mention Tuva Labs. I'm not familiar with them, but I do know Click, they're a BI tool. They have a data literacy project site where they have a data literacy assessment that people can take. I think it's dataliteracyproject.org. So they have one. But again, I think the problem with those assessments is it's relative to what people feel data literacy is. So for example, Click's data literacy assessment is taking you through a lot of statistics, which is fine, I think, you know, but it can be daunting to someone who generally is very interested in data and is very good at querying, but then they're like, I have no idea what a Gaussian distribution is. So it's like, you know, so I still think that the industry needs to kind of normalize as to what they feel their literacy is. And you know, apologies that it's not a definite answer this person may have been looking for, but I think it's still just one of those challenges that we have as far as trying to understand like how to assess data literacy.
Well, and I'm loving seeing some of the various different comments in the chat. If you're watching the chat, there's some links there if you want to go ahead and check those out. It's great to kind of hear from the folks who are here at the table, also being part of this conversation. Rama, before we pivot to our next questions, any final thoughts on how you approach this through your monitoring and evaluation lens in assessing data literacy?
Yeah, I think Alan and Mary kind of spoke to this in terms of that there isn't much of an industry standard in terms of what data literacy actually means. And so for us, really, and I kind of keep going back to this, is we kind of look at the context first, because, you know, the example Alan uses, someone doesn't know what a Gaussian distribution is, right? But if your job requires you to know what that is and you don't know, then, you know, we could argue that you're not data literate, all right? Whereas, you know, if you more on the qual side, right, and, you know, you won't really need to know what the Gaussian distribution is, or if your job doesn't require you to do that, then you don't quite, you know, need to do that. And so I think also it will be quite challenging for the industry to come up with a industry standard of what data literacy actually means, because ultimately for different people it will mean different things. And so probably what that might mean is having like subcategories for what data literacy mean for different industries. And I think that might actually be a step to go, because trying to paint everyone by the same brush, I don't think will quite work, because, and as we're seeing as well, is, you know, just the data world and what data literacy can mean, you can dice it up a whole bunch of ways as well. So yeah, it's really very relative. And I know it's also like, the answer isn't very definitive, but I think sometimes we just need to be okay with having answers that aren't definitive. And it's weird because data, you know, is supposed to be that thing that, you know, gives us facts, and you can actually say, no, the data says this, right? But, you know, it's sometimes we need to have leeway for some subjectivity in that as well. And I think data literacy should kind of follow that route too.
Well, and this question and our conversation so far keeps pointing to kind of data literacy in a work environment. But I think right now, and again, kind of channeling Sarah a little bit, thinking about the importance of data literacy and how we navigate the world around us in terms of the ways in which data is presented back to us, whether it's in quantified self data on our Fitbit trackers, or it's looking at the statements and the summary reports that are in our online banking systems, or it's even just opening up a newspaper or pulling up, I mean, even the New York Times or Washington Post or a local paper and seeing charts and graphs and needing to actually have a baseline understanding of data to navigate the world. I know that that's something that Sarah's pointed to before in our conversations in terms of really thinking not just about what this means like for folks in a work setting. And it challenges me to think, do we need to have a way of assessing that? Or is it really something that we should really think about as a cross-cutting value for this kind of baseline level of data literacy? I know we've got a great question here from Soti looking at the question about data governance. So they wrote, I have worked for NGOs, and as the data guy, I've had many problems dealing with data ownership and governance. So how do you suggest people in companies divide responsibility and ownership around shared data, since being able to actually interact with, visualize, use data, and become more data literate as an organization relies on having actual reliable, dependable data available that people trust? Any thoughts, Mary?
Yeah, this is a big topic for me as a market researcher, because people, I'm making a contract with every single person I deal with that, I'm going to responsibly share their data, right? I have to be transparent with them about what I'm going to do with it and who else is going to see it and how it will be used. We have to, I originally got into literacy because of data privacy and data security issues. When someone gives you their data, it's an act of trust. We don't own that data. Right. And if Harvard Business Review has a really good article not long ago about responsible data stewardship. And especially in a business context, if we use data to make money, but we don't protect it, then, they have a term they call it data entitlement. And we have to, as practitioners, really examine our privacy policies, be transparent about how we communicate those. We need to evaluate the technology that we're using to protect data. And when we the partners, if we're sharing data with others, what technology, when we let go of the data, where does it go? You need to have, they recommend things like a data accountability report that's published, with a regular audit of data assets and storage and collection techniques. They talk about, celebrating as organizations less data use and responsible analysis. There's a book called Just Enough Data, right? Conducting just enough research. They talk about things like pairing employees who touch the most sensitive data, who have the most sensitive data access, so they can check and balance each other. Organizations can establish privacy committees and conduct, again, that are responsible for these audits. And then we really need to look at our data sharing agreements within our technology and examine how data handoffs occur, because that's where the problems are when things leak out. And those are, common fault lines for breaches. And then for those entities in your organizations that are the employees or staff or people who are exercising really good data values and data sharing values, we want to make sure that we reward those folks for having thought through unintended consequences.
Rama?
So actually, I have a question for Mary. So I mean, a lot of your answer was around like the onus being on the company, right? So how do we best help individuals in terms of like knowing how to best protect their data and what data to share, what not to share? How would you go around that? Because I mean, as much as we can ask companies to kind of be the bearers of that, how much do I, as myself as an individual, how much power do I have and what can I do?
Right, and so that it was funny because Alan was like, "Are we going to touch on privacy?" Right, when we were talking in our notes yesterday, and that's actually how I got into literacy, because I feel like you can't trust organizations, you can't trust anyone with your data, So you have to understand yourself as a person who's touching your data, like, and what your data is and what people are using it for, And most people just don't understand. You say the word algorithm, they have no idea, I look for examples again, like New York Times has a really good thing called the Privacy Project, and they show like a snapshot of an ad that you might be served as an individual, and they dissect the ad and show you where the data came from in that ad. So they say this came from your bank records, this came from your voting records, this came from the DMV, right? And that's sort of helping. I love that as an example because it helps the regular person to see how much of what their data is just sold and used, and profited from. So yeah, your point is really valid that if you don't have data literacy, you have no ability to protect your own privacy. And really, there's no such thing as privacy anymore. But that's a separate chat.
So we've got some more really great questions coming in. So I'm going to pivot away from data privacy a little bit. Ryan actually asked, do you think that data literacy is something that non-data people actually desire? Or is this something that we as data literates, let's call ourselves that, practitioners, feel is important and therefore deem that data literacy should be taught and learned? Oh, it's a good question, Ryan.
I'll tackle it. I think that it's probably it's probably yes and no. It's probably there. I think there is probably a percentage of, I guess, less data literate people who really do want to be more data literate. They may not realize it, some of these people, but it can help them answer their question. So I am going back to a business context, but it can help them answer their questions. Like a lot of times, and what I've found, people really do know their business. You know, people who are responsible for a book of business, or they're responsible for certain goals, and they really do want to get the answers to their questions. And so I do believe that there are people who really want to be quote unquote data literate, and I think there's some people who off the bat want to be, but I think there are also some other people who are probably intimidated by the word data. And I also think that because we don't have a benchmark of what data literacy is, they don't know who they want to be. So I think it's a mixture of different things, but I do feel that data literacy is important because just the nature of our environment, the nature of our societies, us needing to have information like yesterday, you have to get more comfortable with data. And what that means, it doesn't, again, mean that you have to know how to use Tableau, or it doesn't mean that you have to build a predictive model, but it does mean that you need to be able to find ways to answer the questions that you're trying to solve.
Any follow-ups to that, Rama or Mary, that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I would just say that I think that most folks, you're exactly right. The word data is intimidating to people, and it goes back to this relevance barrier. And something we've talked about in some of the other answers, right, is that people need to understand, you know, everybody talked all about how the flatten the curve was like the best data visualization. And the reason I think that flatten the curve did what it did was because of the relevance, right? It was a very simple visualization that hit at such a time and covered something that was relevant to a huge swath of people, and you know, it was sort of hit you in the head, right, the takeaway. And so I think most people don't recognize that they need to be data literate. I really love this quote from Shoshana Zuboff from her Surveillance Capitalism book, and she talks about sort of the fact that because we're being tracked everywhere, and there's this like psychic numbing, you know, and that people seem like they don't care or they stick their head in the sand. But I think it's because the idea of trying to for someone who's not data literate, data literacy feels overwhelming.
Fair. Rama?
Yeah, and I think a lot of our conversation has been in and around like the business context, and I think also just people seeing how data can be used in their day-to-day lives. I think that changes things. Just as Mary said, kind of making it relevant to your life. And so interestingly, I once attended this workshop. It was an inclusion workshop, and one of the facilitators told us that her and her partner actually have M&E for their marriage. And she's not a data person, right? Her work involves around like inclusivity and how to make organizations more inclusive. But she said, you know, we kind of realized that, hey, our marriage, we kind of need to be tracking whether things are working or not, right? at that point in time, I was like, you guys are crazy. But more and more now, when we speak about data literacy and trying to figure out how we can actually get more people to realize that every single situation, or most situations and most decisions that you make, are based on data. And if you can find a way to read and interpret that data for yourself, you probably will find that you're actually making better decisions in the long run. So yeah, I think that's probably the first thing is, Mary also mentioned it, like data is very intimidating, right? So kind of bring it to people's relevance, make it relevant to them and make it less intimidating. And if at that point, when they actually fully know the full power of data and what data actually entails and what data literacy is, then we can probably better answer that question of saying, oh, I know what data literacy means and I'm not interested. Whereas, you know, we kind of asking people whether they're interested in data skills when they actually don't know what it entails and what it can do for their life. So I think that's probably the first step, is just like, yeah, getting it to people that what they can actually do with it and what data actually really is.
Well, and Mary, your comment about the flatten the curve graphic strikes me because that was really an infographic and a framework. It wasn't based in real actual numbers. Those are quite wavy lines, right? And it's interesting to me because I saw lots of criticisms after it successfully communicated to a lot of people, data practitioners saying, well, that was an oversimplification and it wasn't effective because it actually oversimplified the model. And I think that in my mind kind of points to a great question from Alan asking, what do you do when yesterday's best practice becomes today's poor use, especially for those who aren't as familiar with how to read and interpret data, and that those changes may make things even more confusing? And how do we just navigate that changing landscape of what is considered correct in our space around how data is presented and shared? Alan?
Oh, all right, I'll tackle it. Everyone else is on mute. Okay. All right, I do see the question, so let me try to understand it again. So what to do?
Or other thoughts, Mary or Rama, if you want to chime in. It's an interesting one in terms of thinking about kind of how our own kind of changing standards can actually create confusion for those who may not be part of our practitioner community.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I would just say that I guess you have to have open communication about it. And I know that's probably not the best answer, but you do just have to communicate, like, so, or you start, I guess you can, if you are introducing a new practice or something that's evolving, you can show like maybe where the former practice fell short and then how this is either improving on something that we've done. Like, I know the flatten the curve, I kind of stay away from those type of topics because of what you mentioned, but it's one of those things where the flatten the curve, I think, gave the message it needed to give, but it probably wasn't the most accurate way to present it. And so I'm fumbling here, but I don't really know because I've been in these situations, and I guess the only way that you can do with moving from like a best practice to a new practice is just to communicate that you're doing it and understand, showing like where this new practice is filling in the gaps from any weakness that was in the former practice.
Other thoughts, Mary, Rama?
Yeah,
and I would say if anyone has other thoughts too, they want to chime in the chat box, feel free to put your thoughts there as well. We're open to that two-way dialogue as best we can. Rama, sorry to cut you off.
Oh, no stress. So I think I'm going to put my M&E hat on and just say, I think with all these processes, right, I think for me, it's always important that, you always have checks and balances to make sure that, what you are intending to do is still happening. And if, you're constantly evaluating what you're doing and what processes you have in place, and you come up to a place where you realize that either there's a gap or there's some unintended consequence of this particular process, then it probably is, a good time to kind of change it. And also with these constantly changing processes and things that are coming up, which I think will also happen at a more rapid pace with, just innovation constantly happening and people always ideating things, is that even when you are considering making that switch is, making sure that you've kind of taken all the deliberate, not evaluation, but you've actually done the due diligence to this new process that you are going into, because also another thing that you don't want to do is if you say you're using a particular process and you want to change it and then you go and change it to something that actually is even more detrimental than what you're moving from, right? So I think constantly is just evaluating what it is that you're trying to do and what results you've been seeing. And ultimately, if you need to change, then as Alan said, you need to communicate it well as well. And you need to show your reasons, and also your reasons need to kind of be good enough to make that change or to even stay.
Sure. Well, and we've got a couple questions coming in that focus more on looking at kids. I know, Alan, you mentioned being involved in different initiatives around teaching kids about data early on. Maria asked, to start with, is it realistic to think about implementing some sort of data literacy strategies in school programs? Should we start working on making future generations data literate factually rather than intuitively?
No, I think it's definitely important to start incorporating data literacy early. There's a lot of things that I'm sure we all wish we would have learned in school. And, again, this goes back to what is data literacy? And I think it is getting that familiarity around data, getting people in a mindset that, you know, we are in a data-driven society and what that means. Some programs that I've seen, like I mentioned, the one with the gamification, that's just a way to get middle school kids interested in data, knowing that they can play Space Invaders and then they can look at each other's scores. They can see who scored the highest. They can see that, okay, Tom played 5 times, he got a higher score. So you can start teaching like practice makes perfect. So it's different ways to kind of incorporate data into your everyday life because it is there. And a lot of times we say things and there's actually data behind it. So again, practice does make perfect. So this person played 5 times and so they tend to have a higher score. Or maybe someone didn't, so maybe they're an anomaly. So it just starts conversations. And then as you get older, there's another project. I was talking to someone, they were in Rhode Island, so they had their high school students take samples because you know, New England is a lobster industry up there, and so they were trying to find the optimal spots so they can fish lobster. And so they had the high school students start taking science samples as to what would be an optimal spot for that. And so not only, and this was a rural area, so it gave them this opportunity, and it also helped them understand like how this experimentation or science experiments was helping to impact their community. So it goes back to the fact that, you know, being in a data world doesn't always mean it has to be a capitalist thing. It can be a very community thing, and it can impact your everyday world. So to answer the question, I do think it's important to start incorporating data literacy early.
Mary?
Yeah, there's a really good Freakonomics episode from about 8 months ago and it's something about how America does math badly. And you know, there's a section of that about the fact that the College Board has been kind of sneakily adding, you know, data-oriented questions even into the English section of the test. And the reason that they did that was in an effort to try to reduce inequality for people who, you know, would pay to have tutors. If they had a data literacy section of the test, right, that would be, you know, there'd always be those people who threw a bunch of money at that in terms of tutoring. But if they build it into the test as a whole, they sort of then force America's curriculum to try to you know, build some data literacy in sort of through the back door, which I thought was really interesting. They said, you know, if you look at the SAT, you know, that over the last 10 years, it looks radically different than, you know, for some of the older ones of us on the call who, you know, did not have those questions on their SAT. The other point I wanted to make about Alan's data stories is I use that as an example a lot because, you know, they look at things like the nutrition label on, you know, a cereal box, and they talk about how that's data, right? And it's just when I just keep, with the audiences that I'm talking to, everyday people need to see that data surrounds them in their daily life. They need to see examples. And why would you care about what's on a nutrition label, right? And then, you know, all the things that you can do from there. So I think it's really important.
Rama?
Yeah, I definitely think that children from an early age should be taught about data literacy. And just to use like my nephew as an example, he's 8 and he's like one of the smartest kids I know, and I'm not just being a biased uncle. But I mean, at this point in time, he calls me and is like, Uncle Rama, I'm trying to download this game. I don't know how to download it. It's not working. I'm logged into my profile, and I'm just thinking, wow, like this is insane. You're 8. And I wasn't doing those things when I was 8, right? And I think we just need to give children the opportunity to be able to learn these things. And yeah. So I was also about to say, I can't quite remember the name of the organization, but I saw this mother on Twitter was talking about how there's a program for kids. I think you need to be at least 9 years old. And it kind of goes back to Alan's point of like creating data literacy through gamification, where now children go on and learn how to code, but the big thing is they're learning how to code their own games, right? And then they share those games with their friends. So it's like small examples like that in terms of how do we create these lessons, but for children. Because ultimately, practice does make perfect, and really starting early on is probably like a very good first step to kind of get to that point. So that, I mean, as Mary even mentioned, like reading a label and knowing what that means is very important. But I think also just to kind of take that a bit further, in South Africa, our challenge is, I think, is a bit bigger than that, because there've been reports released that, you know, by the time kids are in grade 5 or the 5th grade, a lot of them struggle to read for meaning, right? So it's like, how do you then teach someone to be data literate if they can't read for meaning? Because, you know, you need that first step of, okay, I actually kind of understand for this age what I'm reading. You know, it's relevant for my age. Whereas now, if they can't even read that, then it becomes a very tricky problem. So I think definitely literacy is something that should be taught from a young age, whether it's, you know, data literacy, whether it's reading, whether it's mathematical literacy, all sorts of literacy, just so that they have more exposure to it, and yeah, they grow up interrogating things more.
So Michael asked a little bit more pointed question and asked when and should primary education environments introduce students to these core ideas of what data is, how they produce it, how many people use it. I know I got excited watching my 18-month-old go ahead and line rocks up, and I was on a ledge, and I was like, if only we can start to work on the sort order now from largest to smallest or something else. This seems like a teaching opportunity, but at 18 months, I don't think he's quite there yet. But when should we be starting to go ahead and teach and share these kind of concepts, whether it's in the formal education environment or even for those of us who are parents?
I'm not an educator in that sense, and so, but I do have 3 kids, and so I have tried to be very intentional about exposure, and getting, you know, and trying to get them doing extracurricular that's related to, you know, the skill sets, right? The foundational skill sets that go into visualization. And by God, one of them is going to be a visualizer. Probably the middle one, but so I think there's an opportunity, like you brought up, Amanda, like I think you can, visualization is a collection of skills. Data literacy requires, you know, breaking down, you know, into and as Rama pointed out, a variety of skills. And so I think that you can begin to introduce, it's not a linear thing, right? It's a circular thing. And you can begin to introduce foundational skill sets in curriculum, you know, very early on. And I think that we don't have to think about it as just being in this bucket of data, right? Like it's about hands-on engagement. And you know, the I Am a Book just is releasing, and with DVS folks involved in that. And you know, what I love about that book is that it was designed for all ages, because they said that, you know, they really feel like wonder is something that is ubiquitous, right, across all age groups. And really, the learning data visualization skills is about, it's directly connected to a sense of wonder, right? And so if we could sort of work it from that angle, as opposed to like that word data and all the intimidating things, you know, that it could be built into all curriculum in some capacity.
Absolutely. Any other follow-up thoughts on that, Alan or Rama? Alan, go ahead.
I was just going to say start early. I'm sorry. I was just going to say start early. I think the earlier the better, but you know, definitely start incorporating it in different facets or phases. As you know, as far as parents are concerned, they know their children, they know what will help them learn. But as far as, you know, formal education, it probably can start, you know, like again, you know, this group who's doing the middle school with the gamification, it probably can start a little bit before that on different levels. And then as it becomes more in tune, as you develop, you know, you'll probably be more comfortable around data than maybe some of us have been in our generations.
Sure. As we go ahead and dig in and think a little bit more about the organizational context, pivoting back that way, Brian asked about the data integrity of an organization. And if the data integrity, wholeness, accuracy, et cetera, of an organization or team just starting out using data, or who wants to, can be oftentimes be reliant on the actions of non-data people. The quality of the data we have is only as good as how it's actually captured and generated. And maybe I'm embellishing a bit on Brian's question, but maybe that means how the tagging and tracking is put into a website by developers, capturing and gathering some of that data you mentioned, Mary, but we only have as good of quality data as that tagging and tracking is. And those developers aren't necessarily data people, they're developers. There's also a number of other examples of that. As we think about how we cultivate data literacy within an organization, the idea that we need to enforce data literacy as a priority from a top-down perspective seemed like it may work poorly, asked Brian. So what are any of your thoughts on how we actually entice some of these data adjacent or non-data people in our organization to come over to the data side, as he describes it? How do we bring people along and fold them into our world? Rama?
I think it kind of goes back to a point I made earlier regarding some of the work that we do in nonprofits. And you can kind of see like people's eyes like light up when they start realizing, you know, what data means for them specifically. And, you know, the thing is, you kind of need to see it in like two senses. So people kind of need to be able to see the big picture of like what the data is, but then they need to see what their work does to create that bigger picture, right? And if they can then understand and see that, you know, their work actually goes into like this big organization, you know, or this big data set, they are probably more likely to be, you know, to be willing to learn about data and actually come to, you know, the data side. Because ultimately, if it doesn't seem like it affects them, then chances are they're probably not going to be that interested, right? But if you can say, look, if you don't collect this data properly, what is going to happen is it's going to go through this data chain, and when it gets to the end, you know, the data isn't going to be accurate, and all the work that we're doing here won't, you know, it will kind of go to waste. So people kind of need to see how important their tasks are in the bigger task of everything. So yeah, I'd probably say that's the first step, is target the person and also their whatever role that they're playing.
Mary?
There is a resource that I would recommend called, there's a Medium post called The UX of Data by a woman named Lex Roman. And she has this really cool UX of Data worksheet. And, you know, she talks about, you know, defining who owns what when it comes to data. She talks about the importance of, you know, formalizing definitions when it, you know, and things like that, you know, that sort of help. And then she just kind of walks through, it's just a great resource for if you're just trying to kind of get that established within your organization, or you're trying to repair, you know, some chaos within your organization. It kind of really just boils everything down very simply into how you might approach sort of getting some team or organizational literacy going.
You are so full of resources, Mary. I love it. I feel like my reading list for the next couple of weekends is filling up quite quickly. Alan, any closing thoughts from you on this question?
I agree with both Rama and Mary. And I'll just say that I think it, you know, in this particular case, it does just come down to collaboration, identifying everyone's strengths and their talents. You know, from my own experience, you know, I've worked where we do web tracking or web tagging. And a lot of times when you do not include the people who are actually going to use the information, you don't get anything that's useful. So what I'm saying is that a lot of times you will have data teams who have no business context doing all the work, and they have to do that heavy lifting, but they need the input of people who are actually going to be deriving the insights, understanding, you know, where our customers are going in terms of a website and who they are. So I've seen that happen. The same thing with dashboard development. If you exclude the people who are going to actually use the dashboard, it's not going to be useful to them. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, you know, you do need to have everyone involved in your data related projects, even the less, you know, technical people or less data and data literate, because they know what they know, but they just don't know how to necessarily get at it. So yeah, that's my closing thoughts on that. You definitely need to have that level of collaboration.
Yeah, and I think you're speaking too to transparency, right? That they understand the process through which that data gets collected, and then understand how that data translates into the KPIs or the metrics that matter for them. And I've seen the pain points when, you know, a new release of a new web page or site goes out and the tagging and tracking isn't there, and you can't go get that first 2 weeks of data back, right? And so I
Exactly.
think helping them understand how that data gets captured, whether it's with web tracking or I wrote a piece about how COVID case data gets collected and understanding what's that process through which we actually collect data, these numbers that we're staring at on a screen. How does it get collected, and where does that data collection process impact the quality of what we're looking at and that data integrity? So I think that the points you've all made really, to me, speak a lot to transparency and making sure everyone has a shared awareness. We had a couple questions come in about the idea of how do we help and enable our policymakers and politicians to become a bit more data literate in a world today where we see a lot of facts and stats being cherry picked and pulled out around the world by different politicians to suit their own specific narratives. And if anyone chooses to be brave enough to tackle this, how can we, in a positive way, help to enable more data literacy and data fluency amongst our policymakers?
All right. I would just say that, you know, this is an issue that comes up even in the business context. You know, you have a marketing team or you have a certain leaders, you know, we're what I call spending the data. And so I think that's just something where you have to have a level of responsibility, you know, data integrity. A lot of times, okay, and if you want to go there with the politicians in a very perfect world, when you are providing information, you add caveats. So you can say, this is why, this is how I arrived at this particular statistic, or this is how I arrived at this particular analysis. I did it based on this type of data. And again, we're talking perfect world, it's not actionable per se. But when you are in these type of positions, you know, and just kind of using that, you have to add caveats. You have to say, I use this particular sample, or this is based on this. So this is what, you know, if we were in a perfect world, that's the type of advice I would give.
Sure. Rama?
Yeah, so I'd just like to add on to Alan's point, and I think particularly now around the pandemic context, is a lot of times what you found is obviously people are going to share lots of information, right? Particularly on social media. And you'd kind of read this article that is, the headline of the article is something that you could even call as clickbait, right? And people are sharing that, right? And then when you kind of go read it with your data literate kind of lens, right, you kind of know what to look for, and you actually realize that actually like this isn't as big a deal as they kind of making it out to be, right? So the point of like adding caveats and actually saying how big the sample size is, where you got it from, what it actually means, is very important, because I think as well what we do is we assume politicians aren't ordinary people, and which they are. So a lot of times, you know, we kind of have to look at them as that, as they are ordinary people, and, you know, they will make mistakes like all of us will, right? And with data, it's one of those things, and data literacy as well, is that, you know, we just need to create a space where people actually also interrogate data more. I think that's the more important thing, that, you know, just seeing a statistic or a report published by, you know, some organization doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, this is correct. And, you know, so I think for the politician side, I think it's just creating a sense of them actually interrogating what it is that they're reading, because yeah, if people just go on this way, then, you know, you can spin data in any way, shape, or form, and people will believe what you say. So people just need to have that interrogating eye when they look at things, which I think is important.
Mary?
I have,
Alan, you want to chime in for a second there?
I just wanted to a quick chime in because Jessica McQuiggan on the feed, she says ideally a data literate public will demand data literate politicians. So I just want to quickly say, because I want Mary to speak, is that we also, this is the other question that's been coming around, this is the importance of being data literate public people. So we will know that when we see certain things like this, you know, how credible it is.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that same thing, Alan, that, you know, that Jessica's comment was a big deal, right? Like that's why I just feel like it's so important. And you have to be able to hold people accountable, and you can't do that if you're not data literate. I posted a link in the chat to a Brookings article about what policy analysts need to know, you know, why it's important for policy analysts to become basic data, you know, get some basic data literacy skills. And that particular article had a couple of resources, and they're recommending, you know, that policy analysts learn R, you know, and, you know, so there's, you know, that's not something that they've been thinking about in the past, but, you know, you need to do that now. You know, that's why it really is, there is no, I don't really think there's a sector where it's not, some level of data literacy isn't relevant.
Well, I even think at a high level, I know Alberto Cairo has a great kind of checklist or framework for, before you click retweet on a graphic, go ahead and walk through and ask yourselves these questions in terms of asking yourself about what's represented there, what's the story being told, who collected the data, how was it collected, and some of that just takes a little bit of extra digging sometimes. But before you go ahead and click retweet on a cool graphic or something else, check and make sure if there's even a data source on there. If you can't effectively source the data and know where it came from, we can't answer a lot of those other questions. And I'll look for the link to that and flag it in the follow-ups in terms of the resource links that we have for this. So as we're getting to our last 10 minutes and wrapping up for the day, I know one of the things that brought us all together originally was this big question around what can we do as data practitioners in the wider world, not just our organizations, but in our lives. What can we do as data practitioners in order to actually go ahead and help to build data literacy? How can we help?
I can talk just about a few things I've tried to do in my own practice. You know, so I'm doing a lot of these accessibility talks around literacy and fluency because I really just want to try to help raise awareness to the issue. And then also where, you know, workshop formats so that, you know, you can help sort of expand, you know, people's capabilities and build their skills. I've been encouraging our clients to think about, you know, their data collection processes and procedures, and, you know, and thinking about, a lot of times they're just not thinking about it. There's not somebody, they're not trying to do anything evil. They just aren't very responsible stewards because it's not top of mind, or they don't have a data person. I've been trying to forge relationships with data scientists and bring them into our conversations, and make my clients and my community members aware of people they can follow on Twitter and in Instagram, especially because Instagram is a great format for visualization to help people understand topics. I've been trying to pay attention to interesting data sets that are relevant to things that are happening in the world or that are important to our communities, because many of our community members have never even seen a data set. They don't know what that means. There was a really good one in Data is Plural recently about analysis of protest behavior, which is important to many people in our community. And that's stuff that's a little bit harder to get your hands on from an analysis perspective than perhaps like a public health data set, right? You know, anything that's behavior oriented, as Rama pointed out. And then we've been exploring, you know, I've been trying to talk to our clients about elongating their project timelines so that they can build in some time to establish data values and to establish and to think about their collection. And that's always hard, right? Because everybody's timelines are super compressed and they don't think they're going to get anything out of that. And we really try to make the point that if you take the time to do this now, you're going to avoid very costly and painful unintended consequences down the road. And then, you know, we're talking about alternatives in evaluation with our philanthropy and nonprofit partners that move toward more equity and impact-based metrics. Because a lot of times our philanthropy clients are requiring things of the people they're granting to that they can't even themselves, you know, afford, you know, and to, you know, so it's just, we're really just trying to encourage that kind of awareness in our client base.
I just want to add that, you know, I think we should, you know, like I started out earlier in our chat, is just having that empathy. I know it's a very basic answer, but it's having what I call data empathy. Like, so again, yes, understanding where the data lives, where it's flowing, but also to understand, you know, your stakeholders, understanding what role they play in the overall ecosystem or scheme of things. And I think that's a great start, just to begin as data practitioners having that responsibility and pushing data literacy, or pushing people to be more responsible with data. Kind of like Amanda has in her hashtag Viz responsibly. So
Viz
it's kind of like
responsibly.
we
Always
have
Viz
to,
responsibly.
yeah, so we have to do our part. And I think empathy with anything in life goes a long way. So.
Rama?
Yeah, I think a bit of a different point, but I think just making data fun. Because I think, you know, we've mentioned quite a few times throughout this conversation just how daunting data usually is, and that automatically puts people off, right? And also, we just also spoke about like the top-down approach, where a lot of times that doesn't work. So if generally people who are working within an organization, they themselves are interested in data, that push from the bottom could actually change things and make organizations change, you know, from that perspective of the person actually doing the job. And to kind of get there, you know, you need to get the people on the ground, and they need to see the fun in it, and they need to see the value in it too. So it just kind of goes back to that point about, you know, how as us as citizens need to be able to hold our politicians accountable, particularly around like the policies that they make and what data they're using. And so if workers in an organization are able to hold their leaders accountable in terms of just data and what it does, and, you know, they themselves getting more training on how to be better or more data literate, that could also help. So I think making data fun so that people can actually be keen for it should be something that we as data practitioners should also really look to do as well.
And can I just follow up? Oh, sorry, Ellen. I just want to,
yeah, you first.
I just want to follow up really quickly on that point that Rama made about top down. I totally agree that, you know, bottom up is important. I have worked on projects though, where, you know, I was almost having to strong arm, you know, a data project in, you know, at the mid and lower tiers of a company. And the person, you know, the CEO who was behind that project was visibly not adhering right to the policy and procedure, and so thus the rest of the company was like, well, if he's not doing it, then why should we, right? And I'm trying to force people who don't have the skills to do something, you know, to be vulnerable and to learn things that are hard, and their leadership isn't willing to do that. That's a recipe for failure on that project.
Champions. We need champions.
Yeah, I think Mary and I are always triggered by the same points. So I was going to say the same thing. Like, you know, I understand what you're saying, Rama, from like bottom up, but I do think that just for everyone out there, I think it is good to have executive sponsorship. You know, you have to have your leader. And when I say that, it goes beyond your leader just saying to be about the data, but that person also has to take that action and actually do it as well. So I do want to just kind of show both sides. I do think that top down can be helpful in certain organizations, maybe even larger ones, to have that executive sponsorship, to have that level of influence to kind of herd the organization in a certain way, especially with data initiatives and all the people who have had the pains of doing data governance, you understand. So.
Well, I know we're wrapping up on our last 5 minutes of time. I'm going to give you all a moment to collect your thoughts on this final question. So reflecting on everything that we've talked about today, on your experience as a data practitioner, if you were going to sum up the key takeaway you would want someone to take away from this chat in a tweet, though I won't hold you to quite the character limit, what is it that you would say to them? And as you go ahead and think about that, I want to flag just to those of you guys who are still on the line with us and joining us live today, that you'll be able to find the recording of this final session posted on our Fireside Chats page on the Data Visualization Society website. You can find it at datavisualizationsociety.com/fireside chats. It's also where you will be able to find other previously recorded Fireside Chats on other topics with other great experts from across our DataViz community, and where you'll find upcoming chats when they get posted. I'd also like to nudge people that if they are data practitioners, we currently are conducting the annual Data Visualization Annual Census Survey. This used to be called the annual DataViz Practitioner Survey or State of the Field Survey. It's been broadened out and moved to a more secure usable survey platform. So we're finally off of Google Forms, and we hope that you'll give us 10 minutes of your time and share your experience and the work that you're doing in the data visualization space. The survey is open till the end of the month, till the end of September. All right, back over to our panel. So thinking about what the key takeaway is for today, who'd like to volunteer to go first with that key takeaway tweet?
I'll go first. So my takeaway tweet would be, you don't have to be a data scientist to be data literate. Hashtag be data lit.
Okay, mine would be data is the first step toward impact. Impact gives us purpose, but not at the expense of our communities.
Rama?
Yeah, I'd just say incorporate data into your life. You already make data-driven decisions, so just be conscious of the data-driven decisions that you're making.
Excellent. Well, to all of our panelists who've joined us here today, to everyone who chimed in and asked a ton of great questions, we appreciate your participation. We love hosting these kind of live events. If you have an idea for a future Fireside Chat, you can also, on our Fireside Chats page on our website, submit a recommendation for a speaker or a topic. And we welcome the opportunity to bring together more data practitioners across our community to talk about these important topics. Rama, Alan, Mary, it was great to have all of you on the line today. Thank you for joining us from different countries and places around the world. It was great to see everyone, and we hope we'll see you at a future Data Viz Society Fireside Chat.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone. Nice to meet you all.